Sergio Perez has had enough of the Red Bull Max Verstappen agenda and has hinted that he may not be part of the Red Bull setup for much longer. As Sergio Perez comes to the end of his time with the Austrian team, what does this mean for the Mexican Minister of Defense, and will he be staying on the Formula One grid? When it comes to Sergio Perez, I feel like he has done enough over the course of his Red Bull career to warrant his appointment, and it's been great to see him actually win a few Grand Prix to almost put the cap on an incredibly illustrious Formula One career, but I can understand why he would want to maybe move away from that Red Bull setup, and I think Red Bull would be able to entice some exciting talents moving forward that would be able to offer a little bit more than Sergio Perez right now. We have to remember that after the 2022 season, Sergio Perez was completely out of a seat. Red Bull needed a replacement for Albon and Gasly, who hadn't quite hit the mark, and they needed some experience to come into that team, pick up consistent points while still being a number two to Max Verstappen. And if we look at Sergio Perez, I think he's been a great acquisition for Red Bull. He played a role in Max Verstappen winning the 2021 title. He then helped them move into this new era as the fastest car and will probably end this season with a second place finish whilst winning 2 Constructors' Championships in a row. So what's actually the problem? First off, it's likely that Sergio Perez has come to the realization that he's just nowhere near Max Verstappen's level. Obviously, at the beginning of the season, he was talking about possibly fighting for the title. That's just not going to happen. And there's no shame in that. Max Verstappen is putting in one of the generational performances in a Formula One car. We are going to be talking about this for years to come, but being destroyed by your teammate every single weekend is a pretty hard pill to swallow. And even if you are going to go on to win the constructor standings, you'd hope that Sergio Perez would be a little bit closer in the driver's standings too. And then second, it seems that Sergio Perez just doesn't feel valuable at Red Bull. He asked for an environment where I feel I can contribute. And if he determines that Red Bull isn't going to be that kind of environment post 2024, I can see why he'd want to move on. I mean, the car is built for Max Verstappen in one way or another. I know that Christian Horner comes out all the time and says, oh, we just build the fastest car possible. We don't build it towards either one of our drivers. But let's face it, as the car continues, it's more and more difficult for Sergio Perez to drive well. And I feel like is getting towards that point where we almost had the same with Daniel Ricciardo at McLaren, for instance, where he just couldn't get that car to do what he wanted it to do. And every single time the team brought upgrades or they adapted the car, it still didn't really suit Daniel Ricciardo, and it just suited Lando Norris more and more. And we're seeing the same. The car just doesn't suit Sergio Perez, but seems to suit Max Verstappen more and more. And Perez has said multiple times this year that he is adapting to this new style, but he just can't quite click with it. And Perez having to adapt like this has led to his deficit in qualifying. Qualifying is all about feel and flow, and I think when you think of the best qualifying performances, you think of the drivers that can get the absolute limit out of that car. Sergio Perez isn't comfortable enough to get anywhere near the limit of this Red Bull. And then he's battled in races really well and made up positions. So he clearly is still a really good racing driver. He just can't quite click with this Red Bull car. And that's led to him being criticized for not matching Max Verstappen or missing out on podiums because he's had to start from 12th, 13th, 14th. But any development that Perez wants will never really be prioritized because they're always going to point the car towards Max Verstappen as much as they say they're not going to. I think we all realize that they are. And not only does Sergio Perez have to deal with the criticism from the media and journalists, but he also has to deal with Helmut Marko, who is constantly critical from within Red Bull. And a job where you're not respected, I feel like always has a little bit of a time limit. And I think Sergio Perez has just come into his breaking point with Red Bull. And there's people like Helmut Marko and Jos Verstappen that he probably doesn't want to work with anymore. And I mean, Formula One careers are so short, and Perez deserves a team where he's respected and valued, and when he brings things to the table, they're actually considered. So to finish his Red Bull contract and then evaluate his options, I don't think is a silly thing to do. I know it seems stupid to leave the best team on the grid in Red Bull, who clearly have the fastest car right now, especially if Red Bull did want to keep him, but a move away from the Red Bull team might actually be good for Sergio Perez. I feel like there are parallels with Valtteri Bottas, and when Valtteri Bottas moved away from Mercedes, he started to feel useful and human again, and we saw this side to his personality that we never got to see in Mercedes. Maybe the same thing would happen to Sergio Perez. Or, of course, there's the option of retirement, where we talked about Sebastian Vettel and the fact that he left the sport because he wanted to spend more time with his family. Sergio Perez also hints at the same kind of thing, the fact that he does have a family back home in Mexico that he does want to spend more time with. And if he didn't think he could win, he wouldn't be in Formula One. But if he did want to stay, I think he'd be looking for a project team, somewhere where he can go in and be the number one. Again, parallels to Valtteri Bottas going to that Alfa Romeo setup, being the number one there, being the clear, experienced driver and driving the team forwards. I think Sergio Perez would be really good at that. And whilst mentioning Valtteri Bottas, I think a return to the Sauber team during this transition between Alfa Romeo and Audi would be a really interesting prospect for Sergio Perez. He'd be a guiding figure in this new era. He'd be alongside Valtteri Bottas, probably replacing Zhou Guanyu because Bottas is contracted until the end of 2025. But I think he would be incredibly valuable to Sauber. Obviously, as I said, he's been there before, and Sauber would really respect his knowledge after working with the biggest and best team in Formula One right now in Red Bull. He'd be able to come in there and guide the team in a lot of different directions. Or if he didn't want to step too far away from the top of the grid, both Leclerc and Sainz are out of contract at the end of 2024, and Carlos Sainz in particular is linked towards that Audi project, so maybe Carlos Sainz takes that position alongside Valtteri Bottas instead, and Sergio Perez is an experienced short-term replacement for Carlos Sainz at Ferrari, where he can come in and again play number 2 to Charles Leclerc, but still bring in valuable points and put in some really solid performances for Ferrari up until around about 2026, where Ferrari will probably try and get in a new youngster and possibly the future replacement for Charles Leclerc, as much as that seems crazy to think about. However, whilst we mention Ferrari, I feel like we also have to mention Williams. Albon is confirmed for the 2024 season, but Sargent not yet, and Williams have a core player in Alex Albon that may be snatched up by bigger teams. Maybe Alex Albon goes to be the Carlos Sainz replacement of Ferrari, and actually Sergio Perez comes into the Williams setup, maybe still alongside Logan Sargent, and I just feel like Sergio Perez would fit into that team incredibly well. I could see this work in two ways. Either Sergio Perez comes in alongside Alex Albon, he worked with Alex Albon at the Red Bull setup in 2021 when Alex Albon was the reserve driver, or he comes in to replace Alex Albon and actually becomes the team number 1 at Williams and drives them forward for the future, especially because the car really suits Sergio Perez. I feel like fundamentally it's a defensive car, and Perez is incredibly good at defending. There's a reason why he's called the Minister of Defense. Although the final team I do want to mention is Haas. Obviously, Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hülkenberg are confirmed for the 2024 season, but Kevin Magnussen has to be under a lot of pressure. Obviously, he kept hold of his seat because he was better than Mick Schumacher, but Nico Hülkenberg has come in and shown that he is so much better than Kevin Magnussen in that Haas car, and Haas want experienced drivers over rookies. Sergio Perez ticks that box. He brings experience, he brings guidance, he brings understanding of loads of different teams up and down the Formula One grid, and also imagine the parties between Sergio Perez and Gunther Steiner. Like, we know both of them love a drink. Imagine if Haas got another pole position with Sergio Perez. Like, I don't think we'd see them for a couple of months. So there are a lot of options for Sergio Perez moving forwards because he is an excellent asset to have. He never should have been nearly out of a seat in 2021, and the same can be said for 2025. He's shown that he should not be out of a seat come 2025 if he wants to stay on the Formula One grid, and any team that I feel like puts an arm around his shoulder will get the best out of him and drive him forwards and get that passion going again for Formula One from Sergio Perez. But if he did decide to leave the sport, I would be gutted. I would completely understand. Obviously, he's coming towards that point where he does have a family at home in Mexico that he wants to spend more time with, and winning championships at Red Bull to round out his career would be a hell of a way to go. Multiple Grand Prix winner, national hero. I don't think there's much more that he can achieve in Formula One apart from the fact that he can go to a team and help them move forwards. But at the same time, if Sergio Perez left, he would just be one of the greatest drivers that we've seen. I'd love to know what you think. Where do you think we'll see Sergio Perez come 2025? Does he stay at Red Bull? Does he move further down the grid? Or does he retire from Formula One altogether? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, I also made a video about the future of Ferrari. So click that link and I'll see you over there.